Good morning, everyone. I'm Donna Ball, and so I just want to welcome you all. This is our monthly Lunch and Learn event. And before each of these, I do a little intro of our monthly speaker. And then as some background, so as part of our adaptive management plan, the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, we've been conducting numerous bird surveys over the last 20 years, and to help us understand the changes in the bird distribution and abundance as these habitats changed with our restoration activities. We've been really lucky in that the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory has been one of the entities conducting a lot of that research since we started. And we're fortunate today to have Nathan Van Schmidt from San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory join us. And he's going to speak. Also, Nathan is a science director that runs the SFBBO's waterbird and climate change research. And you can read more about his bio on the website. So a little bit of highlight about Nathan, though. He holds a PhD from UC Berkeley, where he studied how anthropogenic wetlands allow black whales to persist through California droughts. And he'll be talking to us a little bit about some drought today. Prior to SFBBO, he worked as a researcher at USGS, UC Santa Cruz, and the International Crane Foundation. And so in his current role, he's leading the monitoring and research on the project's non-breeding waterbird guilds. He's a community scientist monitoring colonial waterbird activity across 9 counties of the Bay Area, looking at waterbird disease and abatement research, and is the lead author of the Central Coast Regional Report for California's 5th Climate Change Assessment. So he's here today to talk about phalaropes and waterbirds that use the South Bay and the Pacific Flyway. And I got to preview his talk, and I think you guys are going to be really excited. So I'll turn it over to you, Nathan.
Thanks, Donna. Yeah, I'm going to hop right into it because we do have a lot to get over. There are a lot of waterbirds using the flyway, lots of different species. Can everyone see my slides right now? Is this set up correctly? Great. And yeah, in addition to thanking Donna, I want to get right off the bat, thank several other people that have contributed to this research. This is a really collaborative data set I'm going to be talking about today. USGS was instrumental for the first decade of the project, especially Susan De La Cruz and John Takakawa at work doing a lot of the waterbird monitoring and initial research on habitat relationships there. Before that, here at SFBBO, Josh Scullen and Max Tarjan did a lot of work on Cargill salt ponds and analyzing habitat relationships there, and some of the graphs I'm going to be showing off. And currently, Amy Parsons, my lead waterbird biologist, helped out with all of these different analyses that I'm going to be presenting today. And many more folks. We have tons of both staff researchers as well as Sarah Wang popped up in the chat there, a volunteer, community science surveyors that have all worked on these projects. And none of this long-term data would be possible without all of that help. Getting a bit even more long-term, I want to start off with this satellite map of California. If you're looking at this, you might see that something looks a bit wrong, a bit off. In particular, there is a very large, let me get my laser pointer here. There's a very large lake at the south end of California that isn't there anymore, because this is a reconstruction of a satellite map of California in 1851. At the start of the gold rush and Western colonization of the region, there was massive wetlands throughout most of the Central Valley, where all of the snowmelt from the Sierra Nevadas drained off and slowly made its way through this network of wetlands towards the San Francisco estuary. Today, it looks very different. Tulare Lake has been pretty much drained and replaced with agriculture, as have 90% of the wetlands of the Central Valley. And I think that's really important context for trying to understand what we see with waterbirds in California today. Here closer to home, that transformation has also been occurring, but didn't stop then during the gold rush. A lot of the earliest transformations of the San Francisco estuary tend to be higher up the estuary, here in the Delta, where as early as the 1860s, there was wide-scale conversion and draining of wetlands there, conversion of those peat bogs into really fertile agriculture via a series of dikes, And then going out from there, in the 1900s, increasingly infill for development, both landfills as well throughout San Pablo Bay and South San Francisco Bay. And then even later on, in the later half of the 1900s, the development of a lot of these salt pond complexes that we're going to be talking about today were finished up. Because of its central nature to all of this, there was a really gradual process. I think one thing that I would emphasize here is that this was not an overnight process, but these changes took place over the course of a century, with birds moving around and adapting to the habitat conditions as they changed throughout California as part of that remarkable transformation of the wetland landscape. That transformation had some pretty negative impacts on especially tidal marsh species. Tidal marshes are habitats which are defined by the tides within the estuary. At low tide, as you see here, there's a big extent of pickleweed flat, which is exposed at low tide, and birds and other animals use as habitat. And then high tide, it pushes more of them up higher and higher along this pickleweed flat. And that variation between those two defines the habitat. There are several important species that were negatively impacted by the loss of all that tidal marsh habitat as it was drained, diked, and infilled. Ridgway's rail being one of them, a threatened listed species, as well as the California black rail, which Don mentioned I did my dissertation on. One of the most difficult and secretive to see birds in all of the United States. They like to run around like little mice in the pickleweed, and they can literally be running circles at your feet, calling up at you, and you won't even see them because they're so secretive. As well as some species that people that are interested in not birds might care about, like the salt marsh harvest mouse here as well. One species that you might not think about as dependent on tidal marsh is people, but people are very dependent on tidal marsh, especially under projected future sea level rise and associated increased storm surges as storms become more frequent and severe under climate change. This is a map of the areas of the San Francisco Bay that are projected to be exposed to flooding under various levels of sea level rise. And well, a lot of it is in this pickleweed area. Under increasing sea level rise, you see more and more impacts to the surrounding communities as well. As a result, we have projects like the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, which are working to build these fortresses of mud to help buffer sea level rise from impacts by providing more mud and more pickleweed to absorb some of those storm surges and protect communities inland. Those communities are often economically disadvantaged because they live in flood-prone areas to begin with. So the strategy of trying to bring tidal marsh back to San Francisco Bay is important because it provides both a win-win for those species as well as for human communities. It also provides some benefits to carbon capture. Blue carbon is a major frontier in current efforts to combat climate change, all of which is pretty important. There is, across, again, the transformation of the estuary overall, the North Bay is now further along into this reverse transformation where we're seeing a shift back towards more tidal marsh, and more efforts have happened in North Bay. They've gotten started a bit earlier. And here in South Bay, with the restoration project here, we are a bit further behind in terms of that timeline of tidal marsh restoration. To date, if you look at the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, we see that these salt ponds that have been converted back, which are labeled in green here, are mostly still in this light green state, like you see up here, which is managed ponds. The remnant salt ponds are labeled in reddish pink here. So about half the ponds are remaining as ponds managed by Cargill Salt for commercial salt production. And the remaining ponds are being transitioned first to managed wildlife ponds, and then eventually many of them will be breached and returned to this darker green, which is the tidal marsh habitat that has been restored. Yeah, so far we are largely in a state where most of the restoration project footprint is currently no longer in salt production and are less salty managed wildlife ponds, which are still a quite distinctive habitat. Eventually, 59% of those ponds, however, will be breached just by taking out some construction equipment, which you can see here, and carving a hole in the levee and letting the tides begin to move in. As tidal action starts working on those, it brings in sediment, and the sediment is deposited. Vegetation regrows. You see that pickleweed start coming back. And then potentially concerningly, eventually, is that as that continues to happen, you might see less habitat for waterbirds over long time windows. As mentioned, currently most of the ponds have been transitioned out of salt production, but they are still pond habitats. So ducks, waders are still using them in a large extent as an open water habitat, which is potentially going to be impacted with longer term once this tidal breach happens and these fill in with vegetation that's more suitable for rails or salt marsh harvest mice. Not a lot of areas for duck to swim around. That is a concern because these are really important habitats for migratory waterbirds. The Pacific Flyway is one of 4 flyways of waterbird migration throughout the United States and the hemisphere more broadly. Within California, the Pacific Flyway tends to go along 2 routes. One is along the Central Valley here, and then one is along the coast, which is the San Francisco is part of it. We see, as mentioned, over 1 million waterbirds using it, either as migratory stopovers, so they're stopping over to feed on their way to wintering grounds in Central or South America, or as wintering habitat outright. And many of those birds are in these salt ponds, which presents a big complication for restoring them. If we are going to be trying to help habitat out for rallids, there's an issue of what do we do with the birds that are already there, which, as mentioned, with the transformation of the Central Valley Flyway, have already lost pretty significant amounts of habitat elsewhere in California as non-tidal, but as wetlands throughout the Central Valley have been drained. And there are a lot of the different birds that use them, which is another little complication. It isn't just one habitat need that we have. We have small shorebirds up here that are things like peeps, sandpipers that want really shallow water to forage around in and probe. Medium shorebirds that are going to want a bit of a deeper pond to be probing in, as well as herons and egrets. Fish eaters that need an abundance of fish to forage on. Or other species, however, like gulls, phalaropes, and eared grebes would prefer invertebrates, which can decline if fish populations are too high. As well, we have diving and dabbling ducks preferring deeper ponds, dabbling ducks preferring shallower ponds that they can dabble in, and terns as well. So these are the 9 focal guilds that we look at when we're analyzing waterbird trends in the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. And we look at them at those foraging guild level because there's too many species to look at them at an individual species level. And when we group them this way, we can try to figure out what their habitats needs might be based on how they're foraging. Trying to conserve all of those species and keeping in mind that it was foreseen at the start of the project that there could be negative impacts to some of these guilds from wide-scale habitat transformation of the project area. There was an adaptive management plan created back in 2007, authored by Lynn Trulio, in addition to several other people. we're lucky enough to still have Lynn on the board of San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, actually helping to advise us in how to think about and interpret these documents. But the adaptive management plan is a very big plan. It covers a process for both researching and monitoring what's going on as the restoration project proceeds. And then, as it says, adapting management based on those outcomes. I'm just going to be talking a bit about the waterbird portion of that plan, but there are a lot of different things that it covers. And within the plan, it covers thresholds for these 7 guilds and or species. Most of them are guilds, but there are 2 species, eared grebes and Bonaparte's gulls, that are called up, or actually 3, and least terns as of special concern. And for each of these species, there's a different focal season that we look at. For instance, diving ducks overwinter in the project area. So we look at diving ducks in the winter. Small shorebirds are passing through during migration, but they use it both during fall and spring migration. So we look at them in each of those time periods. Versus least terns are actually breeding here in the summer. So for that, we're looking at the summer birds. One unique one, which we'll be touching about a lot in the talk, is phalaropes, which are also here during summer, but are actually summer migrants. So we look at their migration during that time period. And for each of these, the adaptive management plan sets out a baseline, which is usually the survey numbers from 2005 to 2007, when the project was just getting started and when we have our first real years of comprehensive surveys of waterbird populations across the area, including both the salt pond project area for the restoration project and the remaining active salt ponds managed by Cargill Salt. The adaptive management plan sets out thresholds, generally 2 bins. One is just saying, let's not let populations decline at all below these baselines. And then for these 3 guilds at the bottom, eared grebes, phalaropes, and Bonaparte's gulls, these are saline specialist guilds that really like hypersaline water. They're mostly found in areas like Mono Lake and the Great Salt Lake throughout the Great Basin. So because these were really likely to prefer the salt pond habitats, it was viewed as unlikely that they wouldn't decline at all, but trying to keep it under a more moderate decline of negative 25% over 3 years, or alternatively, a decline of 50% in a single year. There are also 2 additional guilds I'm going to be talking about today: dabbling ducks and medium shorebirds. These were not covered in the adaptive management plan, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has set additional management targets for them that are kind of comparable. So we look at those as well. The adaptive management plan, it's important to note, these thresholds are not designed to necessarily say that we need to change and adapt at this point, that this isn't a red light, these thresholds. This is more of a yellow light where it says, okay, let's slow down and maybe look at what's going on. And if we hit these thresholds, we should investigate more thoroughly what's going on with these populations. There is a more significant threshold here, which is the NEPA or CEQA thresholds, the National Environmental Protection Act. And these thresholds, as part of the permitting, are looking at more significant declines, around 20% for most of the guilds to more than 50% for the saline specialist guilds. And these thresholds are only crossed specifically if the decline is determined to be caused by project actions. So that is something that we're going to touch base on again as well, because that's a really key difference between these 2 thresholds, is that one's kind of a yellow light, which is, well, we just need to look at this more. And then the bigger question is, if we see a decline happens, is that caused by the project actions, or is this just a species that's declining more generally? So the core data set that we are working with here is a set of waterbird surveys, which are pretty comprehensive in terms of the scope of the project footprint. SFBBO and USGS have been going around to every pond with a scope, driving around the levees and counting every single bird out there. There are mornings that I've been out there counting over 4,000 ruddy ducks before 8 a.m., which in many respects, as a birder, is a dream job. In many respects, it's also a stress dream job. My job is somehow to count every single duck on San Francisco Bay, which is a lot of birds and pretty exhausting field work at times. But it is at the same time pretty zen also. Once you get to around ruddy duck number 3,000, you really get into a sort of flow state, which is nice. Regardless, it is a lot of birds. It can be exhausting field work at times, but we do these nevertheless every single day. Our techs are out there during fall migration, overwinter, and in spring migration. And then we work a lot with volunteer surveyors over the summer as well. And then we analyze each of those data sets based on, again, the main season that's laid out in the adaptive management plan. As a quick summary of these trends, you can see them here. And we've been tracking these for a long time, as you can see. The project has been going for over 20 years, so it's a very long-term data set. And it's a very detailed data set because there are so many different species and guilds within the project footprint. Before we dig into all of these different guilds, we're going to start by diving deep into one guild, phalaropes, which have been a bit of a problem guild from the beginning of the project, and is one of those salient specialist guilds. Phalarope counts declined pretty significantly, pretty much immediately after the start of the restoration project. As early as 2010, which if you're thinking about, they were more than 50% below the 2005 to 2007 baseline. If you think about, again, we're using 3-year windows. So 2010 is the first year that we can calculate that measure, and it was already exceeding it. That 50% decline is both the AMP and the NEPA CEQA thresholds. So pretty significant overall. A bit of background first on what phalaropes are, because a lot of you may not have heard of them before. There are 3 species of phalarope total, so it's a very unique guild, and I think they're pretty cool. Within the South San Francisco Bay, there are only 2 of those species. The third is pretty much a pelagic species that's out on the open water in the ocean. But Wilson's phalarope is on the left here, and red-necked phalarope is on the right. They look pretty similar, but the red-necked phalarope has some unique coloring, which is more distinctive here in their breeding plumage than it is in the wintering plumage we get here, usually in the Bay Area. But they have pretty similar ecology overall. The Wilson's phalarope and the red-necked phalarope are both really cool for a few reasons. One is that they are reverse sexually dimorphic. What you see here in the more colorful bird, in both cases, is the female. The female is more colorful and larger. It's doing the display. It's doing the wooing. You even see this adorable phalarope chick down here. Very, very small. And the male is actually the one that is going to do all of the parental care for that little chick as well. So the females show up, they're bright and flashy. The males then are the ones that are actually staying on the nest and actually migrate down after the females have already left. So that is one thing that is very unique about them. The other thing that's very unique is, click this, here we go, is phalarope foraging behavior. They forage by spinning in these very tight circles. And as they're spinning, they're actually using their feet to kick water out around themselves continuously, which creates basically a vacuum in the middle, and basically a reverse whirlpool forms where it pulls the water up from underneath, the substrate, and that pulls invertebrates up along with it, such that you see the invertebrates come up and then they just pick them up directly off the surface of the water, which is what you're seeing there. What invertebrates are they eating? Presumably, we don't know exactly within the Salt Pond Project area, but generally they're believed to eat these two species. The main prey item that we think they take is brine flies, a Phaedra species. Shown on the left here, these are flies that are extremely common throughout salt lakes as well as hypersaline ponds like we have here for the salt production ponds. If you've ever been to Mona Lake, these are what are buzzing all over around the shore. As well, they may eat brine shrimp, which are shown here, another iconic Salt Lake species. Existing research suggests that the brine fly is probably the higher quality food item. Red-necked phalaropes, at least, studies of them in the lab have shown that they will gradually starve to death if they're only eating brine shrimp because the shrimp have so low nutrient content. Wilson's phalarope, they might be able to eat more of the brine shrimp because they are a bit larger and have longer guts. They might be able to extract a bit more of them. But brine flies are what we suspect is their best food source. Wilson's phalarope is also very interesting because it is really a saline lake specialist again. And it, especially during migration and in overwintering, it connects saline lakes across the North and South America, where they're breeding up in Lake Chaplin, Canada, and then they go down primarily through Great Salt Lake. That's their biggest migratory stopover. Most of the world's population goes through Great Salt Lake. We get some out here in San Francisco Bay, as well as Mono Lake here in California. And then they head all the way down to the mountains of Chile, areas which are themselves threatened by lithium mining, as well as one of their biggest stopovers is Laguna Mar Chiquita in Argentina, which is the Great Salt Lake of South America. So they're really kind of a bellwether for this rather unique ecosystem within the Great Basin. Red-necked phalarope is a bit more of a generalist generally. It uses both saline lakes and coastal habitats during migration, and then it overwinters primarily in coastal waters off of the coast of South America. So, as I noted, these species have big migratory ranges. Their wintering grounds are under threat from lithium mining, which pumps out a lot of groundwater and is drawing down saline lakes there. And there's a big question about whether or not this decline, therefore, was caused by restoration project management actions. As mentioned, this NEPA CEQA threshold that's really more important and really where we want to really make sure that if there is a decline, is it caused by the project management actions? And there's two things that we could think about that might have caused this. For one, because again, we are looking at a hypersaline specialist species. The period of severe decline was right after the initial stewardship plan. This was in the first few years of the project, mostly 2004 and 2005, when the ponds were first transitioned out of salt production and salinity drops. And we see that that decline is happening really steeply around then. So that's one reason to think this could be the result of the project. On the other hand, if you look, that is the restoration ponds, project ponds are in the blue here. The green are the active salt production ponds that are managed by Cargill Salt, and the black is the combined. And if you look at those green ponds that are remaining in active salt production, the phalaropes are also declining really steeply within them as well, which suggests maybe it's not the result of project management actions. To understand this, we decided to study habitat use and do some modeling on these long-term data sets to try and figure out what was going on. There have been two past studies of habitat use that looked at the big full data set. Skull and All 2013 by SFBBO modeled abundance as a function of pond habitat characteristics with the Cargill salt ponds. And De La Cruz et al. 2018 looked, again, did a similar study but looking primarily at the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project ponds, as well as a little bit of the remaining salt ponds just for eared grebes. Neither of these assessed phalaropes in particular, but they did excel at identify what makes a pond a good or bad habitat. These were really high spatial resolution studies. They were looking at microhabitats within a pond. But one thing that they didn't do was directly test what drives declines or increases over time. These were atemporal analyses where we put all of the abundance data together into a model and then looked at what drove the spatial pattern of habitat use, but not necessarily the changes over time that are really important for figuring out what's driving these trends that we've seen. So we built a rather unconventional model to try and assess this question. Rather than modeling abundance directly, we modeled the change in abundance. For instance, you can see year one map of phalaropes here with hotspot, year two over here. So this pond that was unoccupied in year one and had a huge abundance of phalaropes in year two is plus 2,500 phalaropes, and that's our kind of dependent variable in this analysis. Or this pond down here, which had some phalaropes, maybe 75, maybe like 50 in year one, goes up to 550 in year two, would be plus 500 phalaropes. And then we assess the change in site-specific counts from year to year based on changes in habitat conditions and try to find significant relationships between those two things. And we can fit covariates on there with changes year two minus year one, and we can fit covariates like both the salinity and the change in salinity between those 2 years. We explored this as one version of the model, but ultimately we decided to tweak this a bit and look at percent change in habitat in the abundance rather than the raw counts and change. So here we divided it and log transformed it to make it a bit more normally distributed. There are two reasons for doing this. One, we're relating shifts in habitat quality from primarily single measures to changes in waterbird abundance. And there's a reason to think that highly abundant sites should be expected to change populations proportional to the starting habitat quality. For instance, if you have a site where most of it is deep water and you're looking at shorebirds or phalaropes that like to forage in relatively shallow water, if you change the salinity a certain amount that makes it less or more suitable, you might expect the percent of the population to respond a given amount, but you wouldn't expect that to cause the same big shift in a population that a huge site that was almost all suitable water depth would have. So looking at percent changes allows us to reduce the need to model complex interactions between variables that might be rendering a site suitable or unsuitable to begin with. Second, a much more practical consideration is that these transformations very much improve the linearity and homoscedasticity of the model, which means that they're better meeting the assumptions of a regression model, and we're able to have more confidence in our statistically significant relationships. We looked at a lot of variables when we were doing this analysis. A lot of these were derived from Susan Cruz's work on the earlier analysis, especially these top variables, which are kind of the static pond characteristics, things like area, distance to the bay, whether there's disturbance from the public, whether there are islands, things that aren't really changing over time. Then we looked at a second set of variables, which are kind of our core variables we were really interested in, the management actions that might change what's going on in the pond. One is breached. Was it tidally breached to restore tidal action? Mean water elevation. How deep is the pond? Salinity, pH, dissolved oxygen, and water temperature. These pond characteristics will tend to predict the prey population of invertebrates or fish that the birds are probably foraging on. And for these, we looked at both annual terms. So what is the salinity in a given year, as well as, again, the change in salinity. for instance. And then lastly, because we were interested in both potentially weather management changes could have explain some of these changes we see in the bird populations, we also looked at climate covariates as well as an alternative hypothesis, looking at precipitation, both year to date, lagged 1 year in case the birds were responding to poor conditions the previous year when making migratory decisions this time, as well as lagged up to 3 years, which have been seen in some studies where you see that, if you have a bad dry year, a few years later, once that bad dry year has really filtered through the population and there's been low productivity and low survival, you see the population dip then. As well as year to date maximum or minimum temperature during the focal season. If we investigate that and run those models, we get these results out. Looking at this relationship, we see on the left here, this is an inverse relationship, and the right is a direct relationship. So things to the left of 0 mean that as this measure went up, phalaropes went down, or vice versa, as the measure went down, phalaropes went up, and on the right, they moved in tandem. So as phalaropes go up, or as this measure goes up, phalaropes go up. The key things that we saw here are that we saw an inverse relationship with water depth, which is as we'd expect, increasing water depth as these birds are foraging shallowly. In shallow waters, they want to be able to pull the invertebrates up from the bottom of the pool where they're doing their spinning thing. We see an inverse relationship there. But really curiously, the one statistically significant relationship we have is an inverse relationship with change in salinity, which suggests that as salinity decreased in a lot of those ponds during the initial stewardship plan, actually those ponds saw increases in phalarope abundance. Which is very confusing. That's the exact opposite of what we predicted we would have seen. We did see the expected positive relationship with salinity overall, where higher salinity ponds tended to see more growth, but as salinity tended to drop in particular ponds, those saw increases. We did also see some influences of precipitation, with rainier years seeing fewer phalaropes, which we also might expect if the phalaropes are avoiding other habitats that might be drying up in drought years. And so we might see, it might be that we're seeing more phalaropes in drought years actually, as other more rain-dependent systems dry out. That was very confusing. So to try to disentangle this further, we looked at some salinity ranges for phalarope prey items to try and analyze the salinity relationship in more depth. They're ranging from near freshwater to brackish, which is usually estuarine systems, 2 to 30 parts per trillion salinity, to this marine threshold, which is what's out in the ocean, and then 3 bins of hypersaline systems, low, medium, and high. And what we really see here is that the marine is kind of the lower optimal limit for the 2 main prey items. This low hypersaline contains the upper optimal limit for them. And then the mid hypersaline, these 2 survive in it, but they're not doing as well as they would have otherwise. And then above 150 parts per trillion, you see both of these pretty much drop out. The ephydra in particular earlier, and the artemia last for a bit longer. And when we binned those that way and looked at salinity at abundance over this last summer, we saw that that phalarope abundance is highest at the marine to moderately hypersaline bins, as we would expect based on those prey items. This extremely hypersaline ponds are avoided, as are the brackish and low salinity pond habitats. So this also, one of the other things that this was a pretty encouraging result. We're like, okay, great. We can see that they are selecting hypersaline ponds, maybe just not crazy salty ponds. Stuff that's on the more salty, more or as salty as seawater, which is what we would expect. Good sanity check. We also decided to look at foraging observations here. So as the birds are pecking, we went out with 2 clickers and decided to record the number of attempts each peck, as well as the number of successes, which is the number of times that the birds actually swallow a food item. And interestingly enough, it's probably hard to see this over Zoom right now, but you can see actually the birds swallowing by if they open their beak after a peck, they actually capture their prey item in a bit of water, and the capillary action of opening their beak will pull that droplet of water with the prey item back towards the back of their throat, and that is how they swallow. So it's a unique trick of their foraging physiology that you can actually count the number of times that they successfully peck and swallow something by whether or not they open their beak directly after the peck, because that means they captured something. So we were able to count both of those. Get YouTube here. There we go. And here we see a similar trend to what we saw with a more direct mechanistic link to actual habitat quality here, where this is the number of times that the birds are actively foraging per minute. And we can see that there is, again, a general trend here where this low hypersaline, mid hypersaline ponds tend to have the most pecks. The saltwater ponds and the high hypersaline tend to have lower numbers of pecks overall, as well as the brackish. So we do see that, again, the birds do like salty ponds, but maybe not these super salty ponds that were the original salt production ponds. If we look at the number of successes, we see, again, a very similar thing where there's this cluster of low hypersaline ponds that are being really actively used for foraging more frequently and more successful foraging. We do see one exception to this, which is that the near freshwater pond sees the highest rate of successful foraging. This is a unique pond. It is a Sunnyvale water pollution control pond. I think that's the acronym there, which is a treatment pond for sewage discharge. So extremely high nutrient environment, very unnatural and unusual in terms of definitely has a lot of invertebrates in it, but not what a system you would see in nature, which is a bit of the exception here. And we can see, again, those same general patterns with success ratio. So this is kind of the amount of peck successes divided by the number of pecks. I can see that here there is these saline ponds, both mid and high hypersaline. They're seeing pretty effective, low and high, see pretty effective foraging rates. So these are probably areas where they're kind of energetically getting their most bang for their buck. So we do see evidence that they do like these salty ponds. So that explains this, where we have this decline in salinity increasing the number of this increase in birds where salinity declines. This is probably the shift from the high hypersaline to the low. But then what about this? Why are the birds declining in the first place? That doesn't actually answer our question about what's going on here. To dig into this, we decided to look at the historical record to try and see what trends in phalaropes were before the salt pond restoration project to begin with, to try to contextualize those trends in the bigger picture. In 1986, the earliest time that there was a comprehensive survey, SFBBO had 40,000 phalaropes within it, just Wilson's phalaropes. And that's what we're going to be talking about here, which is very close to around 50,000 in Mona Lake. So a very large, very significant population in that year. Today, we see about 1,000 birds at peak over the last few years. So that's a 98% decline in the population, even more significant than the decline we saw in the surveys beginning in 2003-ish. So that does suggest the decline might have predated the restoration project. and maybe potentially driven by factors across the range rather than habitat conditions within SFBA. Because there weren't any scientific surveys of phalaropes in SFBA from 86 to 2003, we looked at eBird data to see whether or not we could pinpoint when the timing of that decline was. And we can see, looking at those historic eBird records, that there was lots of variability. This is in San Francisco Bay again, from year to year. But there's some really repeated high counts up to the late 1990s. And if you go back even earlier, some really high counts in the 1970s and 1980s, which are not at all seen since the 2000s. If you look at on a long scale, you see a bit more of a consistent decline. So if we fit a trend line to that back on the linear scale and look at the difference in trend line between San Francisco Bay and Mona Lake, the other side in California, and the important thing here is the relative slope. Birds are much less detectable at Mona Lake because it's a big open lake compared to San Francisco Bay, where we have these levees we can walk around. But we can see that the annual trend line is steepest before 2000, before the start of the project. But there's still a big difference in decline between the two sites, which is confusing. If San Francisco Bay, we don't see like a clear reason why San Francisco Bay during the 1980s to the 2000s, before there was any habitat changes going on, could have seen this big decline. But we can think about what might be happening with these birds more generally. Saline lakes are in danger of collapse worldwide. This is Great Salt Lake, which is their main migratory stopover. Over hundreds of thousands of birds are there every summer. And California isn't the only place that's undergone big transformations. Phalaropes are affected by everything else happening to saline lakes elsewhere, which is generally not good. Several saline lakes have already collapsed worldwide. This is Great Salt Lake in December 22 on the right-hand side there. It had dropped to a record low, which concentrates the salt, risking tipping the salinity into those really high hypersaline ranges where the birds can't even use those because the prey items all will die off because it's too salty to support them. We saw this already happen in the past few years at Lake Ebert, another saline lake in the Great Basin. It almost completely dried out in the past decade, and at the time, phalaropes appeared to have abandoned it as a migratory stopover. When the rains came back, it again flooded, and we've seen phalaropes come back and use it again once the habitat recovers. And it's not a big mystery as to why those lakes are drying up. If you look just to the east of Lake Ebert, you can see there's widespread upstream diversion of water for agriculture, which is causing the collapse of those lakes. Great Salt Lake is the same. And Mona Lake in California would also be very imperiled, except it has a court order protecting it, one of the only ones that does. But nevertheless, a large portion of its water is diverted down to LA, which has negatively impacted populations of other waterbirds like California gulls as lake levels have fallen there. And as mentioned also, this is a worldwide problem. This is the Aral Sea in West Asia, which is also pretty much completely collapsed as a functional ecosystem. All of this is going to become even worse under climate change. These diversions have weakened an already fragile ecosystem that have collapsed. And as the weather gets hotter and drier, more variable precipitation, there's a real risk that we could see widespread collapse of multiple saline lakes at the same time, which could be catastrophic for those birds.
Hey, Nathan, we only have about 7 minutes left. So if we do a quicker wrap up and give at least 5 minutes for questions so maybe just a kind of a summary of the waterbirds.
Yeah, I think I'll skip the main waterbirds points here to focus on these guys.
Okay.
But I think these are kind of a canary in the coal mine kind of thing. Phalaropes have experienced really significant declines, and they're one of several species like ear grebe, snowy plover, which we also look at in the ponds, dealing with these challenges. As a result of these, we did actually petition the government to consider listing them as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, primarily due to the threats to things going on at the saline lakes. And I'm going to wrap here very quickly by talking about the other trends. We won't dig into the habitat relationships here, but just to highlight Bonaparte's gull, another saline specialist, also passed the AMP threshold in 2014. NEPA and CEQA, the 50% threshold just 2 years ago in 2023. Eared grebes, the population is up overall, but has been almost extirpated from the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project area. Another saline specialist species. Snowy plovers, another one that uses both coastal populations, but also salt lake throughout the Great Basin. And we can see even similar trends in diving ducks and dabbling ducks, where in recent years, both of these species have declined, in part likely due to weather precipitation trends. And we see that those birds as well track drought, so that there's a tendency for the birds to do poorly in drought years and do better in non-drought years, which we might expect to see for waterbirds. And very similar things with medium shorebirds, where over long time periods they've gone up, but then they've declined again in recent years. Same with small shorebirds, increases at the start of the project, declines more recently. And all of these things, I think, are about how populations and trends and movements are responding synchronously to drought. We see there have been studies of small shorebirds in particular showing that in drought years, they go along the coast because those habitats are resilient to dry years because they're fed by the tides, by estuaries, by seawater. And then in wet years, they move back towards the Central Valley. And I think if we think again about these long-term trends, we see that a lot of these species have hit trigger points within the AMP threshold, at least over these trends over long time periods, because of those bigger oscillations, I think, in the climate. But the real question, I think, is how we can make a system that's resilient to the future as well. Regardless of what's going on here, we know that California and Western United States more generally is undergoing intense transformations historically and in the future. And as saline lakes risk drying up, as we see more intense droughts hitting saline lakes and the Central Valley wetlands, the coastal wetlands throughout California, I think, are probably going to become even more important as refugia under those extreme climate impacts. I think that's really one of the things we need to think about as we're managing these systems, is not just looking at trying to manage what was there historically and trying to understand how we can move beyond, think of this balance of nature towards managing these anthropogenic habitats in a way that increases the resilience of these species over time, so that when there are bad years and birds, we see big spikes in phalaropes, for instance, which are probably driven by drought years historically in the 80s and 90s, that there is still enough habitat remaining that San Francisco Bay can absorb those big populations and avoid strong negative impacts from those species. So with that, I'm going to that quick little wrap up. I am happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Nathan. Super rich presentation of information and data. Thank you. I think we're scheduled to be done at noon, but I think I'll push us till 12:05. Several of us have a meeting at 12:15, but I want to give any of our attendees a chance to ask a couple questions. So feel free.
Hey, it's Pete Dutton, your local eBird reviewer. Were those AMP thresholds, did they take into account the known year-to-year variability in the survey results, or was there not enough data at that point? It seems to me that you could see 25% year-to-year without, just as a natural part of the population measurement.
Yeah, those are 3-year averages. So they do take into account that those 3-year averages of 25% or more decline below it. So it does take into account the year-to-year variability to some degree. The 50% declines don't. And I think that in particular with the phalaropes, the more than 50% in a single year was probably oversensitive. If you actually look at the baseline was calculated from 2005 to 2007, and the baseline doesn't meet its own threshold because 2006 was more than 50% below the 2005 and 2007 numbers. So I think that's a bit of an issue with those, especially with these really variable saline lake species, that a 50% decline in a single year might not actually be that unheard of with the range of variability that these species see. But for the 25% and the other ones, those do take into account multi-year ranges.
Uh, Thanks. One more question, if I may, which is I tried to look at the eBird data as well. And there are super high counts in, I think it's 1974,
Hmm.
also in 2015. But there must be more going into your chart because I think you have like mean monthly counts, something like that.
They're processed, yeah. We're processing them by a number of different ways. We cut them down to, I think, observers that had ever observed a phalarope, to reduce the number of people that like just wouldn't be out doing eBird checklists. And then yeah, we adjusted them with an offset for the number of counts that were done in that month. So it's survey effort as well.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Thanks, Nathan. This was awesome. I learned so much. Um, I was curious about how you're thinking about that where you ended with increasing resilience for these species over time in the San Francisco Bay. If these thresholds are to currently inform, are the South Bay salt ponds, causing any negative impact, and should we stop and change management action? And if the answer is generally no, the bigger system issues of loss of salt ponds across the broader geography that these birds use, then what are you learning about what needs to change about management for the South Bay salt ponds, or is it stay the course?
It's yeah, I don't think I explained that great because I was a bit rushed. Let me try to express this more clearly. Is that I think when you're thinking about the value of habitats, I think that actually the resilience category is potentially more important than the raw counts. So if we don't, if we're worried about extirpation of species, if we're worried about declines and real damage to an ecosystem in a really significant way, worrying about what the capacity of the landscape as a whole to absorb a negative impact, a significant disturbance, is really one of the most crucial measures that we have. So that what I'm concerned about with the phalaropes, for instance, is actually that you saw those big spikes in the 80s and 90s, where I'm presuming here we have not had a chance to crunch these numbers, but I'm guessing that those were drought years, where other Lake Aber, yada, or other saline lakes probably dried up, and you see birds shifting from freshwater dependent wetlands into the salt ponds and into other coastal habitats, which is what we see again in small shorebirds and ducks and a lot of different species. So I think that's when we're thinking about kind of how we're assessing these things, I think that it's not a question so much about is it weather or is it habitat changes. I think we need to be looking at how do our habitat changes affect the ability of us to support these populations through dire weather conditions, because the weather conditions are going to happen. We know that, and we know that they're almost certainly going to get worse. So I think that that's the intersection of those two things. Is when we're looking at these two things, I think we need to think of them together in terms of how we're altering the resilience of the system by changing what kinds of habitat is available in what kind of year.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question for Nathan. If not, I'll going once. So I just want to do a quick heads up that we won't be having Lunch and Learn next month. It's been really there's a lot of conflicts right now with uncertainty in government in terms of reductions in force and other things happening. It's been hard to line up a speaker for next month, but we will have a speaker in April. It'll be Jesse Olson. We'll be talking about the work that Save the Bay is doing in transition zones, particularly at Ravenswood. So look forward to that. So we won't see you next month, but we will see you in April. So, and I want to give a big shout out again to Nathan. Thank you for a really great presentation. So
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It was great,
Great.
Nathan. Thanks so much. And
Yeah.
thanks to everyone for being here.
yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.